It sounds great. We're live and we're kicked off. Welcome everybody who's watching and with us. And as many of you know, and some of you don't, my name is Eric Edmeades, and I've got Dr. Loren Cordain here with us today. And I thought I'd offer a little preamble as to why I would want to do this interview and why I'm excited about it. And that is that certainly many of you who have seen me speak on the topic before or have done any of our programs will know that I'm a big fan of the concept of returning to the past and taking a look at evolutionary design and getting some clues about health and longevity that way. And when I first started on this journey as a young man, I really felt largely alone. It was 1991, 92, and I kind of started thinking a lot about this stuff. And then one day I walked into a bookstore and I saw this book, The Paleo Diet, and I opened it up and I was like, it was like this unbelievable wash over of validation that I wasn't a nut bar, that maybe we were on the right track in some way, and also tremendous refinements of some of my ideas and thoughts on the topic, and so I've been following Dr. Cordain for a long time, and I've been a big fan, and so I'm really glad to have him here to chat with today. And so, Dr. Cordain, thanks very much for joining us.
Well, Eric, it's my pleasure. I'm glad that you and I could get together.
Absolutely. And where are you right now, just so we can locate everybody geographically?
I'm in Fort Collins, Colorado. So we're about Colorado. Well, about 60 miles north of Denver. Gotcha.
I always think Alexander Graham Bell would be pretty impressed with what we can pull off these days. I'm sitting here in Amsterdam Central, having had a slightly late plane and a slightly late train, and literally walked into my room in time to get us started here. So
yeah, that's it's really amazing what we can do electronically and how we just kind of go all over the world.
Yeah,
again, it's my pleasure to be able to speak to you and your group.
Sounds great. So let me give you a little, I know we chatted a little bit on email, and I by the way, thank you so much for sending that piece through on the fluorspad skull. For background for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, my dad's grandfather was a guy named T.F. Dreyer, and he discovered the fluorspad skull, which some people call Homo hamlii and others call Homo sapiens archaic, and it represents a really, to me, a real inspiration. As a young great grandson, I really was caught up in the imagination of what it must have been like to live back then. And that's long before I was thinking about health or any of that kind of stuff. I just had that fascination in general terms. And so years later, when I started, I had this bizarre realization that, every species on Earth appears to have a diet except people. And if we ever want to, it's like if we ever want to figure out what's going on with a captive animal, all we have to do is go look at the way it lived in nature. And if we can duplicate that, then all of a sudden it's not getting sick in the zoo so much. And it hit me, well, wait a minute, we should be able to do that for people. And then I started thinking about my grandfather and his work, and then bam, the paleo diet comes along. So I'm really into this stuff. It's been over a 20-year journey for me, and so I and a lot of my clients have some really neat questions for your point of view on a couple of things. And where I'd love to start, if it's okay with you, and I sort of know a little bit of the story, but for everybody else, I know what it was like for me to stumble onto this realization, and it was really simple. I was reading an article, about elephants in circuses and zoos, and they, how they only lived 6 or 7 or 10 years, and then one day when they, this is of course 100 years ago, and then one day they realized that elephants in the zoo were living like 70 years. And all the zoo and circus owners became deeply concerned about the elephants or their balance sheets, and figured, hey, how could we get 70 years out of our elephants? And of course, what did they do? Looked at the way the wild elephants were living, looked at the way the captive elephants were living, made some changes. And the thing that really bothered me about that article was that it kept referring to the elephant's wild diet. And to me, that was a grammatical, screw up. There's no such thing as the elephant's wild diet. There's the elephant's diet. And that's what got me to this, holy cow, there's a human diet. And so I'd love to know, how did you, did you slip in the shower, bang your head, wake up one day and come up with this? Or, what was your story?
I kind of like you, I had one of those aha moments, and I've always been interested in health and fitness, and I was a track athlete in college, and worked as a lifeguard on a major beach in at Lake Tahoe. So I've always had an interest in this, and I ended up getting a PhD in exercise physiology in 1981 from the University of Utah. And so I promptly got a job at Colorado State University as a professor there. And part of being a professor at a Division I research institute is to have a research focus. And so my focus.
Well, guys, for all my talk of how impressed Alexander Graham Bell would be with technology these days, I'm growing less impressed by the moment. Somehow it looks like Google Hangouts just crashed completely on us. I've lost Dr. Cordain for a moment. We're gonna try and get him back. So hang tight. Thank you for hanging tight. I see most of you are still with us, so hold on. We're working to solve the issue. Okay, I just heard from their office that there's some issue in Colorado, and they've had some kind of internet crash, so they're trying to fix that, and they are planning to be back with us very, very soon. Hang tight. Hold on, everybody. Incidentally, assuming we get this back on track here, which obviously we hope, there is a chat box on the right-hand side that you can certainly write any questions that you guys have about anything relative to paleo, wild fit, any of that kind of stuff, because this is a real, cool and valuable opportunity. And if any of you guys want to actually jump in and enjoy the call with us and actually ask your question live, just pop that in the chat room, and Jessica or Dan will communicate with you if we're going to be able to make that happen. And if they can, they'll send you a link that'll let you jump in. Anyway, hang tight. We're working on solving this problem. Hold on. I'm not sure what's going on. We got a quick message saying that there was some internet challenge they were having in Colorado. So hopefully they're going to sort that out and be able to rejoin us again. If not, I just thought, we're all here together, and what we're going to do is change this up a little bit until we get Dr. Cordain back. And so I think what we can do instead is I obviously recognize some names in there. We have some of our Wild Fit coaches and some other people that are around. And so what I'd like to suggest is if any of you, matter of fact, I'm going to pop a link right into the window here, into the chat window. And if you, let's just see here. If you look over into the chat window, hang on, and you click that link, you can actually join right in. And I know that some of you had posted questions in earlier, and that those questions, it looks like the system lost them, but our team captured some of them. So when we get Dr. Cordain back, we'll answer those. While I may have some of my own answers about those things, I know your questions in that case were intended for him, so we'll wait and see if we get that going on. In the meantime, I guess that I think the most important thing here for me, from a background perspective, and why I'm so fascinated with the work of Dr. Cordain, Rob Wolf, and some of the other real, sort of pillars of the whole paleo movement, is that I arrived at a point in my life where I recognized there's no doubt in my mind that the era we need to be paying the most attention to is the Paleolithic. That's the period of time where our physiology, our dietary systems, our instincts and cravings, our lifestyles were formed and evolved. And then, of course, in this newer period, or the Neolithic, where we start looking at wheat and dairy and other injections into our diet, things really begin to change pretty rapidly. And so for me, the debate is never really about that. And what is interesting to me is that within this sort of paleo world, there is a lot of conversation about, what really is Paleolithic, because of course nobody actually has a time machine. Well, I mean, if you do, let me know. I'd like to borrow it. But for the time being, it appears nobody has a time machine. And so when we go back and look at, fossil record and look at what archaeologists and anthropologists are telling us about that era, it sometimes is guesswork. And so, for example, there are a number of people who are, question, for example, what percentage of our diet should be made up of meat. And there are people who are asking, well, wait a minute now, how fast is evolution? I mean, if we've been having milk for 6,000 or 7,000 years, then why not have it now? And so I think, and there's been lots of questions about honey and fruit and sugar and that kind of stuff. And so one of the real big questions for me, or one of the ways that I try to answer these questions, is experientially. And what I mean by that is, twofold. One is really testing it out from an evolutionary biology perspective. So, when we take a look and say, well, does sugar really create hunger in people? Because that seems like a bad idea, really, and it doesn't seem functional that sugar makes people hungry. But what we have to do is go back in time and say, well, wait a minute now. Right now it seems like that's a design flaw. Right now that seems like a really bad idea. But if you were to go back 100,000 years and live in nature, then maybe you'd have a different point of view. Maybe you'd have a different perspective. Because if we take two populations from that time era and say, all right, well, one population, whenever they eat sugar, it makes them want to eat more sugar, and the other population doesn't have that. Well, what that to me suggests is that the population that does not have that inclination is much more likely to zoom off and eat a little bit of fruit when it comes in season. Not be particularly bothered if they bump into honey. It's like not that strong a craving for sugar. And if sugar doesn't make them more hungry, even if they eat a little, then they'll walk away. On the other side, the other population, they have a different reaction. They eat a little bit of fruit, and it stimulates hunger. It stimulates an appetite, which makes them want to eat more, which stimulates more, which makes them want to eat more, and so on. And so, well, what would be the advantage of that? Well, I think the advantage is if you then enter into winter or a deep drought, it's really clear. There's a massive advantage to the people that ate as much as was possibly available to eat when it was hard to come by. And so it strikes me that those people would have more breeding opportunities and would be more likely to survive. So that's typically how I've tried to answer questions when they've come up with some variance between one person that that's speaking about one aspect of paleo and someone else that's covering another aspect. So I've really tried to do it that way. And then the other way is, as many of you know, actually going and saying, all right, I don't have a time machine, but I can get a 747. And a 747 or a similar plane can take me, into Africa, where there are still people that are living a hunter-gatherer and nomadic existence. And I want to be clear, I don't mean traveling to South America to go see how South American Indians are living, or to go to northern Canada or northern Russia and look at how the northern people are living, in the Eskimos and so on, or for that matter to go and check out the Aboriginals on Australia, because all of those people are transplants to that land. And so where I think the most valuable lessons come from is really going back to where human origins begin, and getting a glimpse at the hunter-gatherers that are living there, and to my mind are the most representational of our past. And so again, when I've done that and gone off and spent time with the Hadza, I've been really fascinated to be able to get a sense in the course of a week how much meat they really do or don't eat, or what their reaction is when they have the opportunity to have honey, and how often honey comes along, or how often they're getting carbohydrates. It was something very fascinating. Of course, I'm going now shortly in a few weeks here to go and do another stay with the Hadza. And I put out on social media, do you have a question for the Hadza? And by the way, if you do, pop it on my Facebook page or send it to me on Twitter, because I've collected a long list of these questions to ask them. But one thing I want to point out to you is some of the questions I've got that I've received have been really interesting. And by interesting, what I mean is they show what a lack of perspective we have on what it's really like to be hunter-gatherer. Like, people are asking me, like, at what age do they learn to read or write? I'm not kidding. Like, and I want you to think about this. And if that was your question, I would have asked the same question before I met them. I mean, we don't think in these terms, but reading and writing is irrelevant to them. They can read the ground, they can read the tracks, they can read the seasons, they can read the plant species and leaf patterns, but words and numbers just don't really have a lot of meaning to them. And so it's really quite fascinating to be able to go and spend time with them, visit with them, and get a sense of what their life is like. Not because I think we should live that way, but because there are clues in the way they live that can help us unlock some mysteries around the way we live now, and why our cravings and why our instincts are a certain way. So with that in mind, I think maybe we're reconnected again. Oh, look at that.
All right. Okay, so let me see here. Eric, can you hear me?
I can perfectly. I can.
Okay, yeah.
I was saying earlier, for all my talk of how impressed, Alexander Graham Bell would be, I'm thinking now, not so much.
Yeah, that's the guy that runs our marketing here, the CEO. He came in and I told him the story, and he says, "Well, that's probably why we went down."
There it is.
Yeah, so it apparently is all over Fort Collins. There's, I don't know, somebody pulled a plug or something.
It happened on my end as well. So it wasn't just you; it was simultaneous. My whole connection went at the exact same moment. So it was really odd. But we had a lot of people stayed faithful to us and are still engaged, so that's good. And I'm not sure exactly where we lost you, but you were giving me the, how did you stumble upon the idea that we needed to start looking at the Paleolithic?
Well, I mentioned, the year was 1987, so I was 36 years old at the time. I'm 64 now. So you say you've been doing it quite a while. I have too. So I've been involved since 87, and I read Boyd Eaton's original paper that was published in 1985 in New England Journal. I read it 2 years later, and as I mentioned, I went through and I got all the cross references, and I have a personality type that just accumulate and compile all this stuff, and so I started putting it all together, and like I said, it's like doing a jigsaw puzzle. I saw the outside pieces and then started placing everything together. And then finally, I got up enough courage, because in that day and age, we didn't have the internet. And so I finally got up enough courage to call Boyd Eaton on the telephone on a landline. And he's a working radiologist. So he was actually on his lunch hour, and he spoke to me for the entire hour.
Wow.
And at the end of when you're two people that are just totally into this, at the end of the hour, he said, "Wow, it sounds to me like you know more about this than I do." That was about the best compliment I think I've ever had in my professional career. So one thing led to another, and I invited him to come to Colorado State University and give a lecture. And he invited me to go to Greece and give a lecture on the topic. And I met Artemis Simopoulos and many other famous nutritional scientists when I was there. And I suddenly went from being a small fish in a small pond to kind of operating internationally and writing papers. And then finally, my wife convinced me to write a popular book, because a scientist, and that's all I was really interested in, was just writing scientific papers. And so she convinced me to write a popular book. I ended up getting an agent, a literary agent, that kind of showed me the ropes. And the first book came out in 2002.
I remember.
And paleo really didn't, go viral until, I want to say, maybe 2007 or 2008, maybe even later, 2009. And now it's just mind-boggling how it's become a worldwide concept.
I was really blown away that it didn't catch on like right away. I really was. I mean, to me, it was like, I'm looking around going, guys, don't you see what just happened here? It was so plain to me, because, of course, you're in 87 when you're having these initial thoughts. My biggest worry was, should I have pineapple on my pizza or not and finish high school? And it wouldn't be until 91 or 92 that I started asking the right questions that kind of led me to that conclusion. So when your book, and I also saw Eaton's stuff, and it was like, oh my God, it was like, so when your book came out, I was shocked. And then Atkins, I mean, it was like, people would say, well, it works. And I'm like, yeah, it works because it's taking one principle from nature and abusing that principle to get a really great short-term result. But man, you got to look at the whole picture. So I was really surprised that it took so long.
I was kind of surprised as well, actually. This idea, evolution through natural selection, obviously isn't Boyd Eaton's or mine or anybody else's. It started off with Charles Darwin, and it's a gift to humanity. That's what it is. And so the application of evolutionary principles to human diet is made, as crazy as it sounds, is it really didn't even get going until Boyd's paper. I mean, we had the knowledge and the information, but the nutritional and medical community wasn't on board. And now, I mean, there are hundreds, thousands of scientific papers that utilize that organizational template.
Yeah.
And the nutrition community, I think, is a little bit slow in adopting it, but they can't deny it.
Without getting too deep into conspiracy theory and that kind of stuff, the reality is self-care is not profitable.
Yeah, you're right. There's not a whole lot of money to be made by when there's no middlemen. If you go to a farmer's market and the producers bring their food there and you buy it directly from them, there's not a huge amount of money to be made with this. And so people don't necessarily need supplements. They just need healthful food. And that's really the simplicity of the concept.
Yeah. It's shocking to me, the simplicity of the message, and that it's then in debate. When I was kind of filling time with our little technical glitch, one of the things I was saying is that I've arrived at a point, we still refer to evolution as being a theory, and that's just a matter of perspectives in time and that sort of thing, I suppose. But to me, the idea that the human diet it stems from that era of human evolution, that's not under debate to me at all. What might be under debate at times is, what was the Paleolithic really like? Of course, I think that's where things get a little bit more difficult. But I just don't see how anybody could refute the idea that we lived, this much of our time one way, and that's where our instincts evolved, our digestive fluids evolved, our nutritional requirements evolved. How could you debate that truth? Maybe you could then debate, well, I think the Paleolithic looked like this, and I think it looked like that. Maybe that's a debate.
Well, it comes down to semantics and terminology. Is that maybe when Boyd called it Paleolithic nutrition, and I called it the Paleo Diet, we coined those terms, and maybe we should have just called it the non-junk food diet.
Yeah.
It probably wouldn't have resonated. And I think
I went out right away. I mean, not right away, but when the internet started becoming interesting and enough to me, I went out and bought the humandiet.com. I've never really used it, but it was like that to me. That's what we're really talking about here. And because, like I said before, every living thing on earth has a diet. So do we.
Well, I think one of the interesting ways of viewing this, and I wrote a paper in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 2005. Called The Origins and Evolution of the Western Diet, Health Implications for the 21st Century. And what I did, I was the lead author, and Boyd was on it, and a bunch of other famous, well-known nutritional scientists were co-authors with me. And one of the ways that we looked at this was to kind of go backwards in time and take away the foods that we now are staples. And as you go backwards in time, from 100 years to 1,000 years to 10,000 years, what we find is that the foods that comprise 70% of our calories in the typical Western diet didn't even exist.
Yeah.
And as crazy as it sounds, is that 4 foods, refined grains, refined sugars, dairy products, and refined vegetable oils comprise 70% of the calories in the U.S. and the European diet. And so when you get rid of those, what's left? Well, wild living foods. And it's pretty nearly impossible for humans to eat wild living foods and develop nutritional deficiencies or insufficiencies. So, we can argue all we want, and I know that archaeologists and anthropologists get involved in this, and they say, well, we don't really know what people were eating back.
Okay, so I don't know if we've lost you again. Okay, so hopefully they'll rejoin us again here shortly. Charlotte, I'm looking at the question that you posted earlier, and let's see. What advice can you offer to this report of digestion elimination to the transition to a real food diet? Yeah, Charlotte, that's a really good question, and I hope we do get to put that to Dr. Cordain. It's something we try to address a lot in the way we constructed the WildFit Challenge, and that is to recognize that our digestive systems in the end become less and less functional because of the way most people are eating, and so the natural ability to produce the right digestive fluids and all the organisms that are involved in digesting stuff are negatively impacted, of course, by all the chemicals and refined sugar, and so that becomes really difficult. And then So what happens the minute somebody switches? Like if you ask somebody to switch like on a Thursday and then switch suddenly Friday, they're going to start eating healthy. Well, is their body even capable of making that transition instantly? Well, the first thing is I would say, well, there can be no harm in doing that. But I do think there are certain things that we can do to smooth out that transition. Most of them do not have to do with helping the digestive system. They have to do with helping our emotions and our instincts and our cravings. And so, for example, in our program, we have created a very staged process of helping people move off foods so that they're giving up foods, not that they still want, that they've actually changed their association with and no longer want. And I find that to be the bigger issue than than getting their digestive systems up to speed, because for the most part, unless somebody's done a really significant amount of damage, your digestive system is going to kind of go, oh wow, nutrition, I remember what that's all about, and over time it will naturally bring itself back into balance. When you consider eating grains, refined grains that have been ground up, and so all of the chemicals and natural chemicals that are inside grains, I'm not even talking about pesticides and stuff, I just mean the grain's natural defenses against getting digested. Well, those things are definitely going to have a negative impact on your digestion, and once those things are gone, then your digestive system is going to kind of naturally come back into speed. I'm not sure if that addresses your question at all, and hopefully if we get Dr. Cordain back, we can put that to him. I saw somebody asking a question in the original chat about the quantity of meat, and I'm really hoping we get to put that question to him, because my observation is that how we might derive that answer as to how much meat people should eat will actually depend largely on which people we're looking at and when. And quite often, I think that people are comparing. For example, when people arrived in Europe, when people arrived in the Americas, when they first arrived to those places, the animals that were living in those places. Oh, hang on, we're back.
All right,
we're back. I'm getting extremely good at filling dead air. I'm going to have a career in television very soon. I can feel it, or politics, one of the two.
All right, I'm back.
Good deal. Good
so,
deal.
It was the Alexander Graham Bell comment that's causing all this.
Yeah, it's all that bad karma I created right at the beginning.
So anyway, I think it's amazing that I'm talking to the great-grandson of the guy that found that very famous skull. And
I wish I could take any credit at all. Some of my DNA is responding to the praise.
Yeah, so that's amazing.
His old house, if I remember the family lore correctly, his old house is now the National Museum in Bloemfontein, which I've been to, and that's where the skull resides. Despite huge attempts by people like UCLA and stuff to buy it back in the day, no, it stays here. So I probably could have lived a much more economically fluid life if he'd accepted their offer.
Well, that's probably where it should stay. It should stay in the area where it was found.
I agree.
It belongs to. It's an artifact that belongs to the world, but it was found in South Africa. So
yeah,
amazing. And I sent you that paper showing that it had been redated to about 275,000 years ago. So that was a very interesting time in human evolution. And clearly, 275,000 years ago, they weren't eating junk food.
No, they certainly weren't. Or if they did, it was junk food was very. One of the things we work with our clients a lot on is the concept of seasonality. And so you have all these diets like fruit is evil. Oh, if fruit's so evil, fruit, and our view is fruit is absolutely not evil unless you somehow move to a planet where fruit is available every single day. Then fruit would become pretty evil.
Yeah. So it's a pretty basic concept, but like anything else, so many people have become involved. There's all kinds of different ideas and opinions on what constitutes a healthful contemporary quote unquote paleo diet. So it's fractionated, and as it should. I think that this concept is mentioned.
It's tough to say. I question that issue of I've sometimes lamented. I got that you were brilliant with your discovery and academic, and then you created this thing, and it kind of and everybody started taking the name and running away with it, and I see the benefit in that. But at the same time, I think one of the areas that struggle is clients come to us at times and they are and they've attempted to be paleo, but then they've gotten confused because you've got one Paleolithic author that says dairy products are acceptable, and another one that says they're not, and another one that says, you know, you should be eating 50% of your calories from meat, and another one says 10%. And, you know, so I on one level, I think it would have been really neat to just kind of control that, but then that assumes you were right about everything. And I'm going to guess over the years, there's times where people have highlighted something to you and you've thought, oh, you know, maybe I should think about that. So.
Yeah, you know, I don't claim to, you know, have an inside track on this. You know, I pursued an idea over the course of most of my adult life. And as I mentioned, I was primarily interested in this as a scientific concept.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm so happy that it is the popular books and the popular writings have, you know, influenced so many people in a positive manner in terms of their health and well-being. That's really what it's all about. So
let me ask you something. It's a topic that we deal with a lot with our clients, and people ask a lot relative to any programs that are relative to that are related to kind of paleo. If I remember correctly, and it's been a long time, but if I remember correctly, you roughly recommend about 35% of diet or calorie intake from meat. Is that about right?
Actually, that was Boyd Eaton's original estimate,
right.
And that came out of an erroneous statistical interpretation of what was referred to as the ethnographic atlas. And the ethnographic atlas is what a number of scientists have used to estimate the plant-to-animal subsistence ratio. So what I did is I corrected that in 2000. We went in and put the ethnographic atlas on an Excel spreadsheet and did the appropriate calculation. And it turned out it was actually completely opposite to what Eaton's original estimate was. And the reason for that is that they failed to put in fish food with meat. And so the ethnographic atlas actually separates the two out. And if you combine meat and fish food, then what we see is a mean value that is actually about 65% animal, 35% plant. So Boyd actually got it wrong.
Interesting.
And, yeah, so we corrected that, and nowadays anybody can get the ethnographic atlas online, and anybody can do that analysis. So there are 229 hunter-gatherer societies that are listed in there, and so we did that compilation, and it's been replicated a number of times in the scientific literature. So, but you know, humans, you know, we're very opportunistic, and we can eat a lot of things. And I think that's the point, is that there was really no single quote unquote paleo diet. Diet varied by latitude, by ecologic niche, season, food availability, and what have you. But if animal foods were available, they were generally preferred over plant foods because of a concept called optimal foraging theory, meaning that any animal, if it goes out and forages for food, they've got to take in more calories than they expend. And so plant foods, at least for humans, are much less nutrient dense in terms of their calories. There's a few that aren't, like nuts and, you know, seeds and
the effort involved in nuts and seeds. I mean, I don't know if you've ever tried to open an almond, but without equipment.
Yeah, so it is, and same thing with optimal foraging theory. Large animals are preferred over small animals. So if you run around and try to catch 150 mice, it energetically is not a very good feedback. So larger animals are.
One of my kind of earliest insights into this was my father. So my father was a very big fan of his grandfather's work. And so my father, who's actually trained as a lawyer and so on, but really he's one of those guys who went to law school because that's what his parents wanted, but in reality, what he was a scientist. And so he wrote a book which I'm sure you'd find fascinating. You can find it at megafauna.com. And it was really a book that's all about human migration and the massive extinctions that humans contributed to and caused around the world. And so when my father, in the early parts of that book, he's telling a story about walking along with T.F. Dreyer and saying, and T.F. is telling him about all these giant buffalo and these animals that are now extinct from Southern Africa, that were even extinct from Southern Africa before Europeans arrived. And so, my dad, I don't know how old he was, 12 years old or something, says to his grandfather, he goes, well, what happened to them? And of course, my great grandfather was speaking Afrikaans, but his answer was, men happened to them. And that was not a popular notion back then. I mean, I would go all the way through my high school still being perpetuated the myth that the Ice Age did it, right? My grandfather was on a notion that was not going to grow popular for a very long time. But it did get me thinking a lot about that in terms of volume of meat eating. So when I think of volume of eating, I don't look at hunter-gatherer societies as being that helpful to us unless they're in Africa. What I mean is, it's not interesting to me what the Inuit eat, and it's not particularly interesting to me what the Aboriginal people in Australia eat, because they're immigrants. I've kind of taken the view most of our evolution took place on the African continent, and so that's where I've spent a fair bit of time with the Hadza, for example. I'm headed there in about 2 weeks and to go hang out with them again. That to me,
that is so cool.
It is. It's very neat.
Yeah. No, your point is very well taken. And Boyd Eaton and many other people that have been involved in this concept at the scientific level, not necessarily the popular level, believe that, and I agree with them, is that that's really the model that we should look at, is that Homo sapiens genes were pretty much shaped in Africa.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of shaping of our immune system that has occurred worldwide, but everything, pretty much the major physiology was in place. And as you mentioned, we've actually published a paper looking at the food groups that would have been consumed by hominids living in Africa after our own species, Homo sapiens, evolved. And it was an interesting little paper, and they're all available at my website. You can go to my website, thepaleodiet.com, and download PDFs of that. This paper we published in 2011 with a lot of well-known scientists.
Yeah, I'll definitely check that out. It's I find it the first time I got to go and hang out with the Hadza, to me it was like getting in a time machine, and all of a sudden I'm sitting around a fire with these guys, listening to them, talking.
Yeah, the clicking language. Yeah, I've spoken to a few anthropologists that have been with them, and I've never been in the field with a hunter-gatherer, so I view it. For me, it's kind of a chess game. It's looking at things logically, but you have to have people like yourself and anthropologists to actually get in and do the field work, because without those folks, we wouldn't have any good information. So
I'll give you a little. I'll turn the tables a little. I'm asking you questions, but I put out a little social media post a couple of weeks ago that, hey, I'm going off to hang out with the Hadza again, and I'm quite well known for that, because I use stories of the Hadza when I'm teaching business, marketing, and health. They relate heavily, and I put this thing out on social media and said, do you have a question for the Hadza? So if you've got one, I've got questions from like John Gray from Mars Venus. I've got questions from Tony Robbins. I'd love to have one from you. You don't have to come up with it on the spot unless it comes to you, but I definitely would love to have one from you.
Eric, what a wonderful offer. I'd have to give that some thought.
Yeah, I figured. So I'm not looking for it right now.
Yeah, no, I can only imagine what it would actually be like, because I've seen, stuff on YouTube, and it's fascinating to know that there are still people that can actually make a living in their environment.
But boy, it really creates an opportunity for me to test stuff. When I read something that somebody's saying about, an origin style diet, a paleo diet, that kind of thing, I having been there, it's not difficult for me to, in my mind, go back into that situation and say, wow, does that really work in nature? And for example, I read my very first writing on this stuff was a book I wrote. I can't even remember when, like late 80s, early mid 90s, called Dairy Delusion. And it was just a huge exploration into the history of dairy coming into our world and so on. And you can imagine, as I know the stuff you would have faced, I mean, from my own family, I faced threats of violence. I'm kidding. But,
we still get those kind of comments, is that, this is a dangerous diet to follow because it eliminates two food groups, dairy and cereal grains. And actually the opposite is true, is that fruits, vegetables, meats, and seafood are more nutritionally dense for the 13 vitamins and minerals most lacking in the typical U.S. diet. So by removing those, paradoxically, those two food groups, it actually increases the nutrient density. And I've pointed that out in the scientific literature, but apparently those nutritionists haven't read those papers.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. You were talking before we got cut off the last time about nutritional density and the choices that people make. And you might like this. I don't know if you could use it, but this is the way I often describe that to people: is you walk into a restaurant and they only have two items on the menu. One is a huge stir fry with a salad, all vegetables, and the other one is a nice big salmon steak or a big hunk of well-cooked bison, again with some broccoli and vegetables. The question is, which one would most people order? They're going to go for the high quality protein. I've asked this with audiences of 1,000 people in the room. 90% of the hands go up for the steak or the fish, right? Nutritional density. But then you ask them a new question. Okay, you can have that, but you have to run around the block 3 times and do 50 push-ups. Now, which one will you? And so now what happens? You've got to think about it. Geez, today maybe I'm just not in the mood. I'll go with the salad. And I sometimes think that that's where the cravings kick in. If you haven't gone out for a hunt in a few days, you and I 100,000 years ago, I'm going, Loren, dude, I've got to have a hippo.
I think that would be a good question to ask the Hazda, is like, what would be their preference? If they could choose anything they wanted in their normal environment, what would they choose? Assuming that they didn't have to, if we didn't look at
I can tell you right now what it would be. I can tell you right now it would be meat and honey. Yeah, those guys are like crack addicts when it comes to honey.
I agree.
Yeah, they're not lucky enough to be able to find it. Have you ever heard of a bird called the honey guide?
I haven't.
So it's a really cool bird. This is really neat. So it flies along, and if it sees you, a hominid or a honey badger, nobody else, a hominid or a honey badger, once it sees you, it's the little bird, and it just starts doing this with its wings until you look. It'll keep doing that until you look. As soon as you look, it starts flying, and you're supposed to follow it. You follow it, it will take you to a beehive. And It's really fascinating. It only does it for people, which of course establishes the million-year. I mean, that's not a, Walt Disney didn't teach them that trick.
No, what a wonderful story. Your experience with the Hazda and honey is very similar to my colleague Kim Hill. And Kim Hill is an anthropologist, and he studied people in South America rather than in Africa. He studied the Ashe hunter-gatherers, and so they were some of the last free-living hunter-gatherers that kind of left the bush and weren't westernized until later on. And so he and his wife studied them, and he describes to me the same thing with honey, is that when these Ashe hunter-gatherers find a bee's nest that's loaded with honey, they'll go up there and they'll get stung like mad. And he said he one time saw, and they ate everything. They ate the honey, the comb, the larva, the entire works. And he said it's not unusual to see a full-grown Ashe man eat maybe 4 or 5 pounds of honey in one setting. So it's.
But what's really fascinating, and again, this is the evolutionary relationship here. The honeys, the bees in Africa don't sting.
Interesting.
Yeah, they're tiny little bees, and they don't sting. And you see, if you're a bee and you evolved on a continent other than Homo sapiens continent, then you get lazy. You build your hive outside. You let it hang from the branch in plain view, because stinging will keep your primary predators away, non-tool holding predators. So you don't need to hide. You just sting. But if you're a bee and you evolve on the hominid continent, then that's not going to work at all. They're going to smoke you out in 2 minutes. I mean, we've had fire for 2 million years, right? They're going to smoke you out, you're toast. So the bees in Africa, they hide their hives deep inside the trees, and the only way to find them is there's a tiny, tiny little wax chimney. Honestly, I'm talking an inch long, at less than a fifth of an inch in diameter, and they lengthen and shrink that chimney to control climate inside and what have you. And that chimney could be 10 feet up in the tree, so it's really hard to find honey in Africa. And so that's why when they find it, they go crazy. But it's certainly not easy.
Let me ask you another question, Eric, about your experience with the Hasda. Is that I've got photographs that I use in some of my PowerPoint presentations, taken by other people that have obviously been with them. And it's my understanding that the way the Hasda make fire is with a fire drill.
Yep.
Cylindrical piece of wood that goes down to another piece of wood, and
I've done it.
So forth. And you have done it. And what I understand, talking to my anthropologist, archaeologist friends, they say it's not an easy thing to do.
No.
You have to have a lot of tenacity, and you have to learn how to do it. So it takes.
It is not easy, and I'll tell you that on the second or third day of trying to do it, like say you do it one day, you do it the second day, your hands become so blistered and sore. Of course theirs don't, because they're doing it every day, but it is not. It really requires. First of all, you got to have this speed, and then the second thing is you got to be putting downward pressure at the same time. So you're kind of going down the stick like this, creating downward pressure. So it takes some effort. But you do it in a heartbeat. We're zooming along, and they shoot a monkey. They grab it. They bring, maybe since people are watching this, they shoot something other than a monkey. And although they like monkeys, I'm sorry. And the minute they bring it down, you got one guy dealing with the monkey. As soon as the other guy knows that there's a monkey on the way, he's already rubbing the sticks. Like it's fast.
He's getting the fire going.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things we talk about what is and is not a contemporary paleo diet is you can draw a line in the sand, and one of the undeniable lines in the sand is the ability to make fire, because once and not just to collect it, but to start it at will.
Yeah.
And so once humans had evolved that ability or that technology, then it opened up foods that they couldn't have prior to that time consumed, like raw potatoes are basically indigestible because the starch needs to be hydrolyzed and broken down. And same thing for legumes, as legumes are inedible and actually even toxic unless they're cooked. So one of the ideas that I had, and I've written about and have been in correspondence with other anthropologists the world over, is when did humans actually have the ability to start fire at will? And the best available evidence suggests that fire use first appeared regularly in Northern Europe about 300,000 years or so ago, even though in Africa there's a cave in Africa where it can be dated back to even further than that, maybe 1.5 million. In all likelihood, those fires were gathered from naturally occurring lightning fires. So if you look at the Hasda and the way most hunter-gatherers make fire is with the fire drill, well, that technology, if you didn't know about it, it wouldn't have been immediately obvious that you can sit here and do this. So it must have occurred by accident, and they must have been doing something else, and they must have been drilling. So they were drilling to probably perforate or put a hole in an object, and by accident somebody saw that this produces fire if you do it long enough. So going back into the archaeologic record is, when do we first see perforated objects? And Neanderthals didn't have perforated objects. The other way to make fire is with a piece of iron called marcasite and flint. If you hit marcasite and flint together, it'll produce fire. But we don't find marcasite at these sites, these caves, and so forth. So in Europe, anyway, it looks like friction with drilling was probably part of it. And starting about 75 to 100,000 years ago, in the archaeologic record, we first start to see bones and shells and things that have been drilled. So it seems likely, and we'll probably never know, but it seems likely that that technology, the fire drill, occurred serendipitously doing something else.
Yeah. I have a couple thoughts. One is you might want to look into Bob Brain, and my dad can point you in the right direction even better. And I'm sure it's in his book at megafauna.com. But Bob Brain did kiln tests on fire. One of the ways they can tell whether or not fire is being used, or whether it's naturally occurring is how long something sat in a fire. So you can do kiln tests to see, look, did this bone was this bone just coincidentally in a forest fire, in which case it might have spent 15 or 20 minutes under blaze, or was this bone repeatedly in a fire for 3 days? And you can tell the molecular structure from that. And Bob Brain did kiln tests on bones and found that we're not talking the creation of fire. Of course, that's a different issue. But the husbandry or the containment of fire dates back maybe 2 million years ago. And
yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think that there's sporadic evidence, of people collecting naturally occurring fire that dates way back before they were able to make it at will.
But but this is interesting though, because let's say, I'm not sure how much, I'm with you. One of the rules, not rules, but one of the sort of tenets of our wild fit stuff is that if it must be cooked in order to be eaten, it is not food. Now, it doesn't mean you should never ever eat it. I'm just saying, if you have to cook it to make it edible, then it wasn't actually ever edible.
That's right.
We might be on a similar wavelength there.
Yeah, so, we're completely on board with that. When I say draw a line in the sand, that's exactly what I'm saying, is that, believe it or not, red kidney beans, which are staple.
Bad news.
If you try to eat red kidney beans raw, they're lethally toxic, not just making you sick, but in rat models, you can kill rats by giving them too much raw kidney beans.
Yeah, it's funny. I think to a large degree, some of the advancements we've made have been great to prevent starvation, but really bad for long-term health. Obviously figuring out grains says, hey, awesome, you can store calories, and so this winter won't be so bad. But at the same moment, what that does is create the possibility that you could be sick, but also the societal permission to be sick. If a Hadza gets sick for 2 weeks, he's dead. Nobody's feeding him. But if you've got grains stored up, now not only are you going to get sick, but it's actually okay to get sick because there's food here.
Well, when you think about grains or legumes, they're seeds, and they're the reproductive material of plants. And if those seeds don't get into the ground to make other new plants, then the species becomes extinct.
Yeah.
So they didn't evolve seeds to feed other animals. They evolved seeds to reproduce their kind. And one of the evolutionary strategies that plants have taken is to evolve what are called anti-nutrients or secondary compounds. And that's what we find in wheat. And
gluten, enzyme blockers, hormone triggers, blah.
Yeah, there's all kinds of things. There's lectins, wheat germ agglutinin, as you mentioned, gluten. And one of the things that plants have to do to make themselves toxic is they have to get into the physiology of an animal. And so that's a tough thing to do, is unless they're ingested. And even if they're ingested, they have to have compounds called protease inhibitors that prevent these enzymes in our gut from breaking down the proteins, because you would have to have intact proteins or peptides, and they have to get past the gut barrier. So the second thing that they've evolved are these compounds that increase intestinal permeability. So that allows large protein molecules to get past the gut, and that's when they do their damage. And so wheat contains multiple compounds. One, gluten, which increases intestinal permeability, and then two, it contains these other anti-nutrients that are pretty nasty. Wheat germ agglutinin is one, and there are others, thaumatin-like proteins, that are dangerous. And that's the same way legumes work as well, except instead of having gluten, they have a compound called saponins, and saponins break down membranes, and all legumes are concentrated sources of saponins, and unless you cook them and degrade the saponins, then that's
not food.
Yeah. So what you said is that if you have to cook it, it's not food. I like that.
Yeah, it's a big part of what, we have a number of different tests that we run, like, when we're trying to figure out some semblance of truth for this. And that's one of them. If it must be cooked, it cannot possibly be necessary, and it probably is harmful.
Yeah. Yeah. So.
Now, your comments earlier on meat have stirred a couple of questions here. One of them comes from a very good friend of ours, Åsa, from Sweden, and she actually, I'm just about to go to Africa with her. Funny enough, she's not coming to see the Hadza, but she's climbing Kilimanjaro with me. But
you're such a peripatetic world traveler. I wish I could go even some of these exotic places.
Hey, honestly, you ever want to go and check out the Hadza with me? You're welcome. I'd love to have you. I think it's something that you would that would add a lot of value to what you're doing in the world. So if you ever want to do that, I'm going again next year around this time. It's 2016. Honestly, I'll send you some information. I'd love to have you.
I better get around to doing that before I die.
Yeah, it's important. Well, there's a bit of a race on, because I don't know how much longer they're going to be around either. The Tanzanian government is working very hard to assimilate them, and resistance is futile. But Åsa's question, I think the comment about the meat calories, she's kind of going, whoa, that's a lot of meat, and we don't normally in our programs recommend that volume of meat for a number of reasons. But what it stimulates for me is a question about, do you perceive there to be a difference in the requirement of meat between men and women?
I've written about this extensively in the scientific literature, and our group was the first group to really, promulgate the notion that protein is toxic. So believe it or not, we do have a physiologic protein ceiling, and I've explained it in a couple of our scientific papers, the one in American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 2000. And so protein can be toxic if you eat about perhaps 30 to 40% of your total calories. And women, when they become pregnant, actually their protein ceiling is reduced. And so I've written about this as well. And so it's not a good idea for women to eat high levels of protein when they're pregnant. So we're suggesting about 25% of calories. My colleague John Speth from the University of Michigan and I have written about this. So if she's interested, just have her give me an email and I'll make sure that I get that scientific paper to her. So what the hunter-gatherers have to do, you can talk to that would be the question I would ask the Hadza, is that, can you eat too much meat? Is it toxic? Are they aware of it? And one of the strategies that hunter-gatherers have done is they use selective butchering. So if they get a real lean animal, they tend to prefer the fattier parts of the carcass.
Yeah.
And so fat, like we in the Western world are unaware of, the retroorbital fat behind the eyes. Believe it or not, the tongue is one of the favorite organs for hunter-gatherers. And
I've watched.
Yeah, and so work from our laboratory actually shows that tongue is about 60 to 70% fat calories, and it's the type of fat called monounsaturated fat, which is like what's found in nuts and olive oil. So it's a pretty good stuff. The marrow is absolutely favored, and
yeah, they love it.
Been from the very earliest times. 2.5 million years ago, the archaeologic record shows that people were cracking open long bones and extracting marrow. And marrow is a very good source of fat as well. It's actually preferred. And I'm sure you know that when you're in the field watching these guys eat.
Oh yeah, no, they're sucking every bone that they break it open, no question. But anecdotally, so I can't address the more scientific notion around meat eating for men and women. But anecdotally, I can tell you, when I go hunting with the Bushmen, we go out, we get something. If we're far from camp, not much of that gets back to camp. And honest to goodness, we shoot something, we take it out of, we're making a fire and we're eating it, and we eat it right then and there, and then we don't talk about it when we get back to camp. I mean, we may as well have stopped off at a strip club, because we are not talking about the meat that we stopped and had on the way back from and the only time that I've seen meat come back to camp and I don't say village because of course they're nomadic and they don't really, stay in one place. But the only time I've seen meat come back to the camp is when is when they've scored something significant, and more commonly is when they happen to catch something very close to camp. Like when you can pretty much hear camp and they kill a bird, then the bird goes to camp. My own observation is that women in the camp are eating, I want to say, less than 10% of the total meat that the men are eating. Now, I don't know if that's consistent through time or if that's something that's more specific now to the Hadza, but I found it interesting.
Yeah, we've actually compiled, the Hadza have been observed in the ethnographic literature, just like what you're doing, and they've been observed by anthropologists who try to take a shot at how much plant and how much animal food they're eating, and it's variable. We have, I know in the paper that we compiled that with John Speth and others, I think it actually was the Hadza and the coon and others have a fairly high plant intake compared to their animal food intake. So
well, and I think that when I made the comment earlier about being a little concerned about looking at hunter gatherers in other places, like something I'm sure you're familiar with this stuff, but were you familiar with Paul Martin at the University of Arizona?
Yes, I know Paul.
Yeah, so he actually wrote the foreword for my dad's book, and he
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so they his work and of course related to my grandfather's work was really what happened to the 11 or 12 elephant, or let's say pachyderm species that were living in North America before humans arrived. What happened to all the mammoths and mastodons that lived in and related woolly rhinos and such. I mean, I've been to the Lascaux caves. It's always fascinating to me walk into the Lascaux caves and there's a painting of a rhino in France. What's going on? Yeah. And so one of the things that concerns me is, can you imagine what it would have been like for, again, you and I, time machine, boom, 200,000 years ago, walk into one of these places where no humans have ever been. The animals have no flight avoidance. They don't know what a bipedal hunter looks like. They're not afraid of them in the least. Early European explorers talk about arriving in these places and being able to walk up and touch the birds. And so you got to think their meat intake would have been really high until they killed everything. I think we lost our connection again. Guys, I think we went. I took the thing over time anyway because of all the connection losses we've had. I know there are still some more questions that need to get answered in here, so I apologize for all the technical challenges we had. I'm not sure what's going on there, but I will definitely talk to Dr. Cordain about coming back and having another chat with us again. I found this fascinating. I hope you guys have. With that, I'm going to sign off and go say goodbye to, try and get a hold of them to say goodbye. Thanks very much for tuning in, and keep an eye out. We'll definitely have a more successful part 2, maybe when the winter is a little bit further along in America. Thanks very much, guys. It's been a real pleasure, and we'll see you at another time for another round of wild talks. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.